Hello and welcome to Always Blue, the podcast where we explore stories, challenges, and triumphs of Mount Royal University's community. I'm your host, Tim Rahilly, president of Mount Royal University.
And I'm MRU alum Scott Cruickshank. And joining us today on the pod, we have MRU professor and Olympic and Paralympic expert, David Legg.
Thank you for having me. Am I the challenging part of the introduction?
100%.
Well, by way of introduction, maybe we won't go forever into this, but how long have you been with MRU and what do you teach and what are your interests in terms of research?
I joined Mount Royal College as a faculty member in 1998, if I recall correctly. And I teach in the Department of Health and Physical Education. I teach both adapted physical activity, which would be sport, recreation, leisure for persons with disabilities. And then I also teach in our sport and recreation management program.
And we know you have a lot of passion for the Olympics and Paralympics. Where did that start?
I always had an interest in sport and the Olympic Games. And it wasn't until I moved west that I learned more about the Paralympic Games. I had worked in Toronto and Ottawa with the Ontario and then the Canadian Wheelchair Sport Association. So I became aware of the Parallel Olympics for athletes with disabilities, the Paralympics. And then when I moved west to do my PhD, my supervisor was Dr. Robert Stedward, who was the founding president of the International Paralympic Committee, which was only created officially in 1989. And so when I came west in the early 1990s, I joined him as a PhD graduate student and really was able to get on almost the ground floor of the start of the International Paralympic movement. And he took me to the 1996 Paralympic Games in Atlanta. And those were the first games that I attended. And subsequently, I joined the board of the Canadian Paralympic Committee in 1999 and became the president in 2010. And so, it's easy to look back now and do the revisionist history as to how this all happened. But it was really the move west and starting my PhD that kind of got this whole process started.
And we should probably note that your supervisor is an honorary degree recipient from Mount Royal University.
A very proud honorary degree recipient from Mount Royal University. Yes, I was just actually in Edmonton on Sunday and unveiling a display case to celebrate him and the Paralympic movement at the University of Alberta. And on the display case is the honorary degree from Mount Royal University.
Well, fantastic. That was a great address he gave. And so thank you for nominating him.
Well, and thank you for recognizing him. He is clearly a very important person to me professionally and personally, and I was absolutely over the moon thrilled when he was recognized.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that perhaps folks who don't go to graduate school maybe aren't privy to is that relationship, right? That you have with that important person in your life, the doctoral supervisor. But can I maybe extend that and ask you about your relationship with your students?
I really enjoy spending time with students and alumni. It's a genuine joy of mine to connect with them, learn a little bit more about them. As an example, one of the things that I just started doing this year, which I'm sad that I didn't start it earlier, is I meet with every single student for 5 minutes, and they have to. It's kind of their first module test where they have to pick a question out of a hat and answer to me orally in my office, as opposed to using artificial intelligence to write another term paper. And this was a way for me to kind of circumvent the challenges with AI. However, what I have learned very quickly is how much I enjoy just getting to know a little bit about who they are, where they're from, what some of their interests are. Whereas perhaps previously I wouldn't have dug that deep to know that they were cowboys, or had all these other experiences like planting trees came up yesterday as one of the avocations that a student had. And so I very much enjoy getting to know them personally. And I would say that that's in many respects a differentiator of Mount Royal University. And one of the reasons that I've come to love this institution and have never left is because of that connection to students and the ability to get to know them and then continue to stay connected with them as alumni.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen you in action at some events, running into alumni or with current students. It makes me think slightly tangentially. In my checkered career, I've worked some customer service and these kinds of things when I was younger. And one of the things I learned in one of those jobs years and years ago was they used to say you only get one chance to say hello. And so for a professor to take that time, it makes a big difference.
Sometimes you never really know what the impact that you have as a teacher and as someone who just cares about somebody can have. But I certainly reflect on the importance and the value of those who were my professors. And not all of them, but certainly those few who spent the time to get to know me, ask how I was doing, recognize maybe when I needed a little pat on the back or something. And I very much want to try and pay that forward.
And when you're like a little old shriveled man and these kind students come up to you and they'll say, I remember.
One can dream, one can hope.
When you're teaching about adapted physical activity, and getting to know the students, what kind of grabs them about the coursework? Is there something that is different from each student, or is there something that maybe all of them are kind of finally getting a chance to learn about and explore?
Yeah, well, part of the conversations that I just had in the last 2 days with it's 2 sections of 50 each, so 100 students over the last 2 days, and many of them commented on that they had never considered sport, recreation, physical activity, or quite frankly anything from an inclusive and accessible perspective, and that they were very much enjoying the opportunity to do exactly that. One of the projects that I have them do is just take photographs of real places that they interact with that are examples of both good and bad accessibility. And many of them, and I encourage them to do this, will take photographs from where they work part-time. And they will comment that they have never considered the bar that they work at to be inaccessible. And so if there was a group of individuals that wanted to come in and one of them was using a wheelchair as an example, there would be nowhere for them as a group to sit. And so I think they do enjoy looking at the world, pardon the pun, through a different lens, and just seeing it through a slightly different angle.
Yeah. Well, what David, inspired you to kind of become an advocate in this realm?
Well, my dad had a disability. So my father had multiple sclerosis, and he was immobile with the exception of his head. He could talk, but otherwise he wasn't an athlete with a disability, but he was certainly a person with a disability. And my mom, bless her heart, was a bit of a badass and just didn't take no easily, and was very much an effective advocate for my dad's quality of life. And so I think I learned by watching her and how she would ensure that my father was able to be included and to attend to various things, that I think that just naturally kind of rubbed off on me.
That's really interesting. I mean, obviously, the personal passion, I think resonates. I think that comes through.
Yeah. One of the classes that I do is I'll take my students on a tour of our own recreation facilities. And then I try to, and with through more of a conversation, we'll talk about what's good and bad from an accessible perspective of our own rec facilities. And I give kudos and props to Cougar Athletics and Recreation. Over the years, they have made some real strides to make it more accessible. And in fact, I would argue that we probably offer more disability-related programs in our campus recreation than any other institution in the country. We're the only university that I know of that has an intramural wheelchair basketball program, and that's because of a partnership that we have with the local club here in the city where they store their wheelchairs on campus. We're the only post-secondary institution in the country that I know of where all the students that take the adaptive physical activity class are given the opportunity to spend a day in a wheelchair. And so they'll come at the start of their day and they'll grab a chair in the triple gymnasium and they're asked to spend the entire day in that chair. Now, there are some criticisms of that process, that idea of trying to simulate a disability. And I acknowledge and recognize those criticisms. But in my opinion, kind of preempting them by talking about those challenges then allows us to really get a neat lens, again, pardon the pun, into the accessibility, both pros and cons of our campus. It's not perfect, don't get me wrong, but I would say that Mount Royal has really made some significant efforts and strides to make it more accessible. I would argue that Mount Royal could really position itself as an institution of choice for students with disabilities, both mobility, intellectual, neurodiversity, et cetera, because I think, again, we take it very seriously, that idea of inclusion and access.
Yeah, and I think the numbers would actually support what you're saying when we look at the provincial statistics in terms of who comes here and why they come here. And so, what's happening in the accessible sport, dare I say, arena, in terms of evolving facilities and, how can we stay on top and what should institutions be doing?
Well, I think one example, and Calgary is certainly an interesting case study of this, is, the building of a new event center, the potential upgrades to McMahon Stadium. And in both of those instances, I would say that a spectator experience for those who have an impairment or a disability wasn't great. But again, McMahon Stadium was built in the 1950s or 60s, whatever it was. I think, forget, it was like built in 100 days or something like that. The Saddle Dome is now, the second oldest arena other than Madison Square Gardens, which has gone through significant upgrades, but it's now the oldest rink. And so again, when it was built in 83, I think, it wasn't at the height of thinking as it relates to accessibility. The new event center will be completely different from mobility and sensory experience for those who have impairments in those areas, whether it's seating, engaging with food and beverage, access to tickets, just the whole pathway from parking lots, like everything will be much more amenable to a positive experience. And I think that's just because of the evolving thinking as it relates to access. So I think that, to me, that's an example. And then if you were to compare that to Mount Royal, when we put in our new seats in our triple gym this past year, part of that was because we wanted to offer more accessible seating options so that, for instance, during convocation. And I would say this to students, when you're coming to convocation, if your grandparents wanted to come and they had mobility impairments, there's not very many seating options for them to watch their grandson or granddaughter walk across and shake your hand. And that's a shame that they wouldn't be given that opportunity. With our new seating structure in the triple gym, that's been completely changed. And so little things like that aren't really that little. Mm-hmm. And you asked me about my mother and my father. So I played football in university at McMaster, and my dad enjoyed watching me play. And my mom would contact all the universities in Southern Ontario, and I'm suspicious that she would get to the president's office in some cases, demanding that, she and my dad be given permission to be able to, so that he could watch the games. And I can only imagine like the president of the university at Windsor phoning the president, at Wilfrid Laurier and saying, "Have you spoken to a Barb Legg? Like, has she gotten to your office somehow? And, have you given her access to, the field of play?" And they'd be like, yeah, we finally gave in.
Well, I can assure you that those kinds of calls do come to president's offices, not particularly about this subject, but whatever the subject of the day is. Yeah.
In addition to being a participant, an advocate, you're also a sports fan, we know. So when you settle in for the Olympics, the Paralympics, is there a go-to event, a go-to sport that you're going to watch every time?
The part of the Olympics that I enjoy the most is actually becoming a fan of sports of which I didn't really know much about. And there are always storylines. There's always interesting, now, obviously there's an alum from Mount Royal, Eden Wilson, who is competing in bobsleigh. So, I'll certainly be paying attention to that. And then from a Paralympic side, as president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, I would often get asked what my favorite sports were that I wanted to watch. And it's like, answering who's your favorite child. And you may have an answer, but you were always loath to share it. I would say on the Winter Games, the para ice hockey, the sledge hockey is going to be one I pay attention to. And in part because the goalie is an alum from our athletic therapy program, Adam Kingsmill. And so for me, it's just kind of neat to kind of see those touch points and those connections back to Mount Royal that are going to be playing out on national television.
So you shared with us your perceptions, which I enjoyed, about, Mount Royal being at the forefront, given your responsibilities nationally. How does Canada stack up in terms of accessible sport compared to those other countries you may interact with?
Well, we were certainly an early adopter to Paralympic sport and disability sport. And I think that allowed us to then be rather successful if you were to look at kind of our medal counts insofar as how we performed at Sydney in the 2000 games. Other countries have caught up insofar as recognizing the value and the return on the investment for supporting Paralympic sports. So I think other countries are starting to invest as well in accessible facilities, coaching, high performance directors, etc. I would still say Canada, though, is very much a world leader in that area.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like, and I don't know a lot about this area. I defer to you. But some of the early folks that we've already mentioned have played a role in governance, I think, and that's made a difference too, right?
Oh, very much so. Well, I mean, so I mentioned Dr. Robert Stedward as the founding president of the International Paralympic Committee. Even on the Special Olympics side, Dr. Frank Hayden, who was a professor at the University of Toronto, is seen as the creator of Special Olympics. And so he, as a professor, created basically a rudimentary fitness program for children with Down syndrome in the 1960s. The Kennedy family heard about this and had a member of their family who had Down syndrome, brought him to Washington to create some recreation programs for children with Down syndrome. And that eventually translated into them hosting the first Special Olympics Games in Chicago in 1968. So whether it's intellectual disability, physical disability, yes, you very much see Canada being at the forefront. And people like Terry Fox, people like Rick Hansen, Chantal Petitclerc, who's a member of the Canadian Senate. I mean, these are all exemplars and real benchmarks of promoting sport and physical activity for people with disabilities.
Getting a lot of attention these days are the 2026 Olympics and Paralympics.
Now, this is the part I'm going to cry.
Well, I was going to ask, how exciting / bittersweet is it for you, given that Calgary voted to not explore a proposal?
Yeah.
I guess that was in 2018.
Yeah, and so I was very much involved in that bid. This is the part where I would like to use some words that perhaps aren't appropriate on a podcast.
Well, what do you think happened?
Yeah, I think a big part of it was just the cultural climate of the day. And if I'm trying to remember exactly, I think this was President Trump's first time as president. If I'm recalling the timing,
It was in his first term.
the first term, and there was just a real sense of lack of trust. The IOC in particular was perceived as, not connected to the Canadian reality, and people did not believe the budgets that were being presented. And as much as we tried to prove our point, it fell on deaf ears, and we just had such a difficult time. And if you're explaining, you're losing, I guess, from a marketing or sales perspective, and we just could not figure out a way to get in front of it. And ultimately, if you were to look at the demographics, it was all of the suburbs outside of the outlying kind of downtown core that voted against hosting. And I suspect in many respects it was because they didn't see how it would benefit them and how it would connect with them. And then why would they want their tax dollars being spent on these things? Listen, I could spend a long time talking about why I thought that was a bad decision, and that Calgary in particular would have gotten such a significant benefit for a relatively paltry investment. Now, again, the federal government, the provincial government would have also, paid, but as Calgarians, we're often complaining about our tax dollars going east and never being returned. And this would have been one of those opportunities where we could have used federal dollars to build a field house, upgrade our Olympic Oval, refurbish Winsport, build residences at the University of Calgary, for the athletes' village, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think if we were bidding today, I think we would be far more I think we'd have a far more receptive community.
And this is kind of an obvious question, but what's the upside when the city gets to host in terms of, for the city, for the province, for the country? You mentioned kind of a showcase for the...
Yeah, like different cities use them for different reasons. If it's infrastructure, and Vancouver would be as a good example of this as any, I mean, they have completely upgraded their port. That has nothing to do with hosting an Olympic or a Paralympic Games, but they saw that as an opportunity to access funding in order to upgrade their port. Red Deer used the Canada Games when they host the Winter Canada Games in 2019 to upgrade their airport. The airport was not used for the Canada Games. All teams that flew in and flew out for the Canada Games either flew into Edmonton or Calgary, but yet they were able to access federal funding because this was an initiative that they wanted to change. We could have used the games to upgrade our transportation infrastructure. So we continue to talk about a rail line from the airport to downtown and potentially, tourism or transit rail lines out to Banff and Lake Louise. That could have been part of the bid budget. It could have had a high-speed rail network between here and Edmonton as part of that, similar to the Sea to Sky Highway or the Canada Line in Vancouver. So cities and jurisdictions can use the games for their own purposes. And again, you look back at what Calgary did with 1988. I mean, there are still many remnants of those games here where we continue to use them to this day. Our residences, the old residences on our campus, were the media village from the 88 games. So there are still pieces that are continuing to show a legacy from hosting. So it depends on what the needs are of the day.
Well, you make some really interesting points. I mean, recognizing, the date and time that we're recording this, the notion, it's not even soft diplomacy, it's diplomacy at this point.
Agreed.
Right? and the way in which sport, and I'll add in inclusive sport, could really be a role model.
Completely.
And those kinds of relationships. And is there something there about the way in which really we have evolved and in terms of the respect afforded to people with disabilities and how we think broadly of the world?
I'd like to think so. And I think sport has played a pretty significant role in doing exactly that. I mean, we mentioned earlier Terry Fox and Rick Hansen. I mean, those are two, if you were to, rank order the top 10 Canadians of all time, I mean, those are two that are probably in everybody's top 10 list.
Sure.
And they arguably are best known by demonstrating the abilities of persons with disabilities through the means of sport. And the thinking, I mean, if you go back to the earliest iterations of disability sport, in many respects, it was to rehabilitate returning war veterans in World War II for the purposes of enabling them to return into society, to find employment, start families, etc. And they were using sport as the way to demonstrate that. And, the catchphrase would be if somebody sees a person with a spinal injury bench pressing 400 pounds, then they'll make the leap that, well, perhaps that person can also work an 8-hour day. And so sport does that. Sport's a very easy way to visualize and see that people with impairments are fully capable. And therefore, it could translate to employment, community service, community engagement, and that it just kind of normalizes that understanding of, well, of course, a person with a disability would participate. We were talking earlier about the programs we run here on campus. We have a wheelchair basketball intramural program on Thursday nights. And initially, when we talked about where we were going to put it, we had discussed putting it in the Stanley Gym, which is the older gym, not as visible or not as open. And I really pushed hard to have it in the Triple Gym because I wanted it to be on a Thursday night, people walking around the track, to look down and to see, oh yeah, wheelchair basketball is taking place here at Mount Royal. Of course it is. And to just, again, to normalize seeing people with disabilities participating in sport and recreation. And I think that then transcends and translates into just a greater sense of inclusion and access and sense of belonging.
So, I'm always taken with, we have, as you well know, your colleagues, we have many great faculty members who do a lot of things, and some balance scholarship with community engagement. And so I want to give you the opportunity to maybe talk about either one of those things or both, like what's next? Like what's next in terms of, the community engagement work? You're all over the place in terms of all these bodies and what have you, but you're also a professor, so what's coming down the line and what are you excited about?
Well, first of all, I don't take the role of being a professor lightly, and I don't take it for granted either. Like, it really is a privilege and very much a pleasure to be able to pursue ideas or thoughts that are important to me personally. And to work with young people that are curious and, for the most part, really want to get engaged and to kind of climb on board. So moving forward, the lunch that we were chatting about earlier that I was at earlier, I'm trying to help some other friends get a field house built in Calgary. Calgary is the only city, I think, over 100,000 people in Western Canada that does not have a full-size field house. I was just in Edmonton on the weekend at the Saville Centre at the University of Alberta, and I think that's one of 4 in Edmonton that they have. And so I'm working with the City of Calgary and colleagues and friends to get a field house built, and in part because of my own personal interest in it being the most accessible and inclusive recreation facility in the world. And that it would then house what's called the Calgary Adapted Hub, powered by Jumpstart, which is an organization that I founded that's a collective group for all the adapted physical activity disability sport groups in Calgary. So I would say that from a more professional and practical, pragmatic side is certainly something that I'm interested in. On the research side, the connection to Jump Sport is one very near and dear to my heart. So Canadian Tire's charitable arm Jumpstart, and they're going to be initiating a number of research-related endeavors, trying to understand the social value of sport and recreation on a national scale. And that's one that I'm really excited to get working on too.
Great, fantastic.
Mhm.
Well, it's there's a lot of what you're saying that's resonating with me, David. Like one, like I will be front of the line helping to campaign for an Olympics if it'll bring the C train to MRU. So sign me up.
We can find room for that, I think.
And I think that I'm serving on the youth sport board now,
Mhm.
and so what you're saying about these facilities across the country, I hadn't understood how very much those are needed right now, and the opportunity as we think about varsity athletics, let alone community engagement, accessible sport, but perhaps a sign of the time, maybe an opportunity. We'll see. I hope it's an opportunity. Yeah.
I agree. Well, and you think of Mount Royal's hosting of national championships for the first time in the next 2 years in men's and women's volleyball. That's just going to give our institution a tremendous opportunity to showcase the great things that we do. And maybe the accessible, inclusive sport and recreation programs that I've talked about can be one of those items that we, again, showcase to all the other institutions in Canada, the great things that we're doing here.
Well, I know you're a big supporter of varsity sport, and, I think all of us at Mount Royal are just so delighted with, our national women's hockey gold medalists a couple of years ago, our men's soccer. The teams are doing super well. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
And not to mention all of them that, like all Canadians, that the athletes we have, they're also really good students.
Oh, well, as a professor, yeah, of course, I would agree with that. And the breakfast that you and I have attended on a number of occasions where we recognize the academic All-Canadians may be one of my favorite events, if not my favorite event that I get to attend every year.
Yeah, and I'm not going to mention any other schools, but I've worked at a couple where you would not see that proportion of athletes being recognized for their academic ability.
I can recall in my third year of university at McMaster on the football team, I received the academic award, and I had a B.
Look at you now.
Look at me now is right, yeah.
I thought I saw something about your office being crammed with memorabilia.
Yes.
Well, I won't ask you about the most valuable piece, but what do you, is there one or two items that are the most memorable for you?
There's one, because I have been asked this before, and there's a print right behind my desk of Gordie Howe that is signed, Mr. Hockey, and it was from his retirement ceremony when he was with the Houston Aeros. And the reason that I have that poster is a student of mine. I think his dad was working in Houston, and so he had a place that he could stay. This was going back to the early 2000s, and he wanted to do his practicum with a professional sports team in Houston. And so he came to my office, and the two of us sat there and contacted all the various pro teams in Houston. This was just kind of nascent internet days, so I think we had to make phone calls to all these places. And then we finally, we got denied by the baseball and the basketball and the football team. And so finally we thought, well, why don't we reach out to the hockey team? So I finally get a hold of somebody in their front office, and I'm telling them that I'm David Legg and I'm a faculty member at Mount Royal College in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and that I have a student who's taking sport management who would be interested in doing a practicum there. And the guy kept saying, Canada, did you say you're from Canada? And I kept, yes, I'm phoning from Canada. Canada? And I'm like, yes, I'm from Canada. Of course we'll take a student from Canada. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. And then he goes, actually, I even know what the project is we're going to get this young man to do. And his name was Matt, and Matt was sitting in my office, so I had him on speakerphone. He goes, do you know Gordie Howe? And I look at Matt, I'm like, Matt's like, yeah, I guess. So I said, oh, of course we do. And he goes, okay, good, because we need somebody to run his retirement ceremony for him, and none of us really know him very well, so we thought he could do that. And so Matt and I are just kind of grinning at each other, and we're like, yes, I think Matt's fully capable of running the retirement ceremony for Gordie Howe. So anyways, in my office, I have this big, massive print of Gordie Howe to David from Mr. Hockey, Gordie Howe.
Well, David, thank you so much. We've chatted over the years at various things, but this is, I think, the longest we've ever chatted about what you do. Very grateful for all the work that you do at Mount Royal, and clearly you're super engaged in the community, and that does a lot for us.
Thank you. Well, and I appreciate your leadership and guidance as our president. I very much enjoyed working with you.
Thanks.